Magic makers. This one, I am really excited about it. It's a tough subject, but it's something that in I'd say the last few years, given everything we've gone through with, you know what I'm talking about. Um, it is something we really need to talk about, something that we've never had. No one sat us down and had a conversation about how do you deal with this. And today's guest, Krista St-Germain, she's on, and we're talking about grief. And it's a subject that, many of us think that we don't have to deal with it till like way down the line. But, in Krista's life and in my life and in recent times, we've all had our share of those like random knocks at the door, or we think it's going to be a great Tuesday and it just turned into be a very different day for us. And so Krista, that is her thing. It happened to her, and she was like, she didn't have the resources or support, and she's like, you know what, I don't want anyone else to feel what I felt. And so I want her on the show because I'm sure there's some people out there who you have nobody to talk to, or your friends mean well, but they just don't know what the hell to say to you. So Krista, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is exactly the kind of conversation that I love having when people are interested in talking about grief. For me, it was a Sunday,
Yeah.
not a Tuesday. But yeah, I mean, life was humming along. I had remarried. First marriage kind of went down in flames. Second marriage was like the redemption story, proof that, true love was possible. And I was just feeling really good. I was 40. And we were coming back from a trip, and I had a flat tire, and he wanted to change it. Stubborn guy that he was, didn't want to wait on AAA, just baby, let me change the tire. So he went to change the tire. And as he was trying to get access to the tire, a driver that we later found out had meth and alcohol in his system just didn't see us on the side of the interstate and just crashed right into the back of Hugo's car. And within a day he was gone. So I went from literally, like, it felt like, like you just said, like you just totally not expecting it. And then wham, your whole life changes. And what I learned was that I was completely misinformed about grief. I didn't know. I really only knew about the 5 stages, which is one of many grief theories. We can talk about that. I thought that time healed. All these myths of grief that made my life harder. I bought into, as many of us do. And so it's really important to me that other people have more accurate information about grief and are prepared to support themselves through something, even if it's not as traumatic as spousal loss, right?
Right. It was funny that you say that, because one of the things as I was stalking you, one of the things I read that you wrote, that you said, there is no end to grief. It's not a game of golf. And I just was like, from everything you hear, like you said, there are stages, and supposedly after you hit the final stage, are you over, or do you move on to another level? And so I think what you just said is that for anyone grieving right now, it could be years that you're still feeling raw.
Yeah, I mean, grief is just so unique for everyone, but I know for sure I had in mind, because what I had heard was about the 5 stages, and because in our culture we use language like journey, which kind of implies like that there's a destination or an end, and also having a history of kind of being a high achiever, like somebody who always wanted to do it right and impress other people. I was like, okay, I'm going to do grief right.
Yeah.
Right. And if I follow the steps, then I'll get to the land, wherever that is. And, and I'll be done. And what I learned the hard way is that grief is a natural human response to loss. And we can't go back in time and undo the loss.
Right.
So we're always going to have a response to it, and it might evolve and change over time, but there really is no such thing as an end of grief. That would require us to go backwards in time and undo the loss. Right. So the goal isn't so much as to get to the end, which is a mythical destination, as it is to move from, an experience that's happening to us to an experience that we are creating for ourselves, right? To integrate what has happened, decide what we want to make it mean, and then decide who we want to be given that it's happened. So we adjust, right? We integrate.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that we have to have a life that's less than what we love.
Right.
Right. But it does mean we want to stop telling ourselves that it's supposed to end, because if that's just such a recipe for suffering. when we think so much time has passed, we should feel better by now, or we should be better, or we should be doing it differently. We're doing grief wrong. There's just no such thing. It's all nonsense.
And I think you're right. Cause I think, you just described a lot of my listeners, the type A++, and, I want to earn the merit badge of grief. And, I don't want to be that person who, you go to a party and everyone's like whispering about you, you just like, I need to put this like facade on that I'm great.
Yeah, totally.
Meanwhile, on the inside, your house is all junky and you're just a hot mess. And you're like, can I get through this hour without losing it?
Yeah. It's so it, right? It's so it. And then if you think grief is supposed to look in a particular way and it's not the experience that you're having, and you try to like conform yourself into this thing you think you're supposed to be having, it makes it harder to actually have the experience that you're having. Right. And advocate for yourself and connect with other people at a time when you really need it. So yeah, it can be a hot mess.
Yeah.
Out there. So I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's like, I think, like you said, everyone talks about the stages of grief. And, and I think when you say the stage, I think many of us think like, is it 2 weeks I'm in this period or 3 weeks? Like, what, do the stages intermingle? And well, first let's rewind. What are the stages of grief? Just for anyone who's like, I have no idea what stages they're talking about.
Totally. First of all, if somebody has no idea what the 5 stages of grief are, I'm actually happy for them. And let's just pretend we never heard this. So the 5 stages of grief, it originated from the work that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler did back in the late 60s. Yeah. And I've want to say, I'm like confusing myself. It's late 60s, late 70s. I don't do so well with numbers, but anyway, at that time, there wasn't a lot of conversation about grief. So at that time, that work was really important. The 5 stages that they came up with were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What's interesting to note about that work is that it wasn't actually about people who had lost someone or something. It was about hospice patients. It was an anecdotal study of what was happening to people who were coming to terms with their own terminal diagnosis.
So I mean, you coming to terms with, a diagnosis is very different than your spouse, dog, person is no longer a part of your life.
Exactly. But also it was really valuable at the time because nobody was really talking about it. Nobody was normalizing what could happen in grief. So originally they wrote their book on death and dying, and then they wrote on grief and grieving and extended those anecdotal stages from death and dying to grief. And in the times between then and now, so much research has been done around grief, but somewhere that staged theory caught on in our popular culture. And that's what most doctors are taught in medical school.
We like steps.
We just kind of, we just stopped thinking that there were other theories and just went with this one. And which is, again, it was valuable in its time, but it's limited and it's not reflective of the experience that a lot of people have. And if you think that's what your experience is supposed to be like, then you'll be asking yourself questions like, am I angry enough? Am I in denial? Should I be is this the part where I get depressed? Have I accepted? Right? Like we try to take what is this crazy, non-linear, messy human experience and put it into nice little linear chunks and stages. And it just doesn't reflect what it actually feels like to experience a significant loss, which is really unfortunate because then people kind of use it against themselves. So that's what I knew coming into grief. And that's why, I don't want people to only think about the 5 stages. It's one idea, but even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she was later in life, really expressed her regret at how people had used her work and turned it into something that was linear and clean cut, because that she knew that wasn't the experience.
Yeah, because it's like if we kind of go through those 5 steps, what if I did accept, so what if I have accepted, hey, they're not here anymore? Then it doesn't, does it mean I go backwards? In my mind, I'm like, for some people, like
Yeah.
you can't accept, like you're there. I'm accepting. Like it's happened and I'm in the moment, but you're like, when do I get angry? Or do like, it's kind of like Monopoly. Do I
Yeah.
pass go and get $200? Like where?
Right. And what does it even mean to accept? Accept what? As though it's a place that we end up, as opposed to like, sometimes I experience acceptance and sometimes I don't. So yeah, it's one of those things that it was useful in its day, but also if it doesn't reflect your grief experience, it doesn't mean you're doing grief wrong. And it's definitely not linear. It's definitely not neat and tidy. There's a lot more than the 5 stages of grief for people to think about.
Right. And you've hit on like a thing that I know that many of my women will resonate with, doing it right.
Yeah. I
And,
know, right?
like there's no playbook, there's no playbook, because your playbook's going to be different than my playbook, than someone else's playbook. And many people right now be like, yeah, I could be okay. And then you're like, oh shit, I wasn't okay.
Yeah. And what if I just never made myself wrong, no matter how I felt?
Yeah. And so I think for a lot of the women out there, when someone, you do coaching for widows, and it's like, when someone says, well, how do I do it right? What is your answer to that?
Yeah. I mean, the really just what makes something right is that we decide to believe it's right for us, right? It doesn't exist outside of us. And so I believe that we just get to be the boss of that. We get to be the authority on what is right for our own grief experience, knowing that it's unique. Everyone's experience, even if we are all grieving the same person, right? Or the same situation, we will each have had a different experience of that person or that situation. We will
True.
each have had different life experiences leading up to that loss.
Mm.
So, of course, we're always going to have a different experience, right? It's going to be unique like a fingerprint. And just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. It
Right.
just is different. And so it's recognizing that and embracing that. And part of it, I think, is also knowing that, all emotions are a part of grief.
Yeah.
We kind of tend to think about certain emotions, but really all the full spectrum of emotion, grief really just is all of our thoughts and feelings and behaviors about a loss. And that's just so broad. So I just try to get away entirely from this idea of thinking about, am I doing it right? And just be like, no, that is not relevant to me, because there's no right here. However it happens for me is how it's supposed to happen for me.
Right. And so
It's
for you,
okay.
so it's, for a lot of people, it's letting go. And as a type A plus plus with a side of A plus plus, that means there's things you can't control, right? Like, one, you can't
Yeah.
control death. As much as you want to, you can't control it. So it's
Yeah.
like, just, and I think this is also one of the challenges for my ladies, is being in the moment, right? It's like, we've had it, we're, here's my to-do list. Grief isn't on my to-do list today.
Yeah. Yeah. And being socialized in this productivity culture, right? Where
Right.
we tend to associate our value with what we get done. And then a grief experience can really impact our ability to be productive, which, if we've wrapped up our value in that productivity, which I totally did, right? It's like, okay, how fast can I get back to functioning, and how fast can I get
Yes.
back to work, as opposed to, okay, what is actually supportive? What do I need right now?
Right. Like maybe
Yeah.
I do need to sit on the couch for the next 30 days and,
Yes.
be okay with,
Yeah.
barely getting out of my pajamas.
Totally. Because it's going to be different for everyone, and you might as well not make yourself wrong for it.
Yeah. And it's fun. It's because as I was reading through your story, and I can see myself doing that. I could see a lot of the women who are listening to that, where you're just like, I have other people who are going to look at me for either support, either look to see if I'm a hot mess. And so the facades go up.
Yeah. 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 And how are we socialized, especially as women, to think of ourselves as caretakers and caregivers, right? If we're the ones that are always doing for other people, then we tend to put ourselves last on the list, which, and then we tend to kind of, source our validation outside of ourselves. So instead of, it's just like a recipe for disaster. It has us looking for other people to tell us we're doing grief right,
Right.
right? Taking care of other people, sometimes at our own expense.
Mm-hmm.
When what we really need is to be like, wait a minute, I have permission to not be productive. I have permission to put myself first on the list. I do not have to be the selfless caregiver. I can actually take care of myself. What do I need?
Right. And with that said, for I think for most people as parents, and depending on what age your children are, feeling like you have to be now the rock.
Oh,
God forbid you have tears in front of your children, or let
mhm.
them see that, what, I am struggling too.
Yeah. I actually just taught a solo parenting and grief class today. And that was one of the things we were talking about, is how much pressure and stress we put on ourselves when we believe that we have to be strong. But people will literally tell you these things, right? They'll
Mm-hmm.
say, be strong for your kids.
Right. Exactly.
And, and then it makes us feel so much pressure at a time when what we need is less pressure, right? Who
Yeah.
said it's better to be strong? What, right? And then also, what does that do to your kids? Or, I'm thinking about your listeners, and it might not be spousal loss for them, but if you're going through something, some sort of grief experience, what message does it send to your kids? Show them your experience.
Right. No.
It says emotions are bad. You
Mm-hmm.
should experience them alone,
Mm-hmm.
right? You need to hide them, as opposed to, can I be a human and let my kids in on what's actually going on in an age appropriate way, that, and also role models to them how healthy humans deal with emotion.
Yeah. And I think to
Why
myself,
not?
it's like, if you were just to sit down and like cry in front of your kid and just be like, what, having a bad day, how much more validating would that be for them when they are having a bad day,
100% agree with you.
versus hiding in the bathroom and crying.
Yeah. Yeah. But it goes against, like, I don't know what you learned growing up, but it goes against, I think, what so many of the women I work with learned growing up. They learned, if you're going to cry, go to your room,
Yeah.
that you should deal with those things by yourself, or that it means that you're weak if you do. And
Mhm.
so it can be a hard pattern to break, right?
It's a very hard pattern to break. There's a movie that Cameron Diaz was in, and the she was the mistress of the woman's husband, and the woman is like crying in front of her, and she's like, look, you don't cry, you cry on the inside like a winner. And like that's what, like, you were told, like,
Yeah.
you don't want to be that emotional woman,
Right.
God
Yeah.
forbid.
God forbid you would be human and
Right.
have emotion. Yeah.
And so so many
Yeah.
of us were taught that. And so you're trying to be the strong one, or you don't want to be that person who everyone feels sorry for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally. I very much relate to that. And for me, it was some of that because he and I worked together. And so, everybody at work, when I went back to work, knew him. Some of them knew him
Right.
better than they did me, because he'd been there 20 years. I'd only been there 10. And so there was this pressure that I put on myself, to be what I thought they wanted me to be, so that they would accept me, and then also not knowing how to deal with a lot of that emotion for me ended up with a lot of eating,
Yeah.
right? Like a lot of eating to try to make the feelings go away. And as we know, that doesn't work out so well.
Right. You're like, no one's ever won that game. If you
And yeah,
if you have,
yeah, I
call
mean,
us.
right. Exactly. Or like for some people, it's shopping, or it's drinking, or
Right.
it's other coping behaviors, that because we just weren't taught ways to deal with our feelings. So we do the best we can.
And so, as someone who's like listening, and they're like, you know what, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
that's me. I'm like, you hit every nail on the head, and it's like, and it could be spousal loss, it could be parent loss, it could be grieving a pet. um you know it all hits us differently. And so, what do you tell people, like, what are some of the, I don't know, like, what are some of like the first steps in just kind of as you process that your new
Yeah.
life?
Yeah. So I would also say we can even broaden up the definition because, sometimes in my line of work, I'm always thinking about grief as it relates to death, but really grief is just the natural response to any perceived loss. So it could
Mm,
be you lost your job, right? It could
yeah.
be, there's just so many things that fall under the umbrella of loss. We expected something to go some way and it went some other way, and
Right.
that's loss. So, but if it's an intense loss, I would expect that in the beginning, not that I want to say that there are concrete stages or that everybody's experience is the same, 'cause it's absolutely not. But in the beginning, for many people, it does feel like your whole world just fell apart, right? You
Mm-hmm.
do kind of feel like you don't know what planet you're on. Sometimes you feel really numb. Sometimes you have what we call grief fog, which is like the prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning part of your brain. It kind of like gets over capacity. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
almost like that buffering wheel that you see when your computer can't quite handle the software. That's like how it feels in your brain. It feels like there's cotton candy or fluff in there.
Mm,
And sometimes you don't, maybe you were always a detail oriented person and all of a sudden you can't remember details for anything. You bought toilet paper 12 times and now you've got a mountain of it because every
right.
time you get to the store, you can't remember, you don't need it. It's stuff like that that can really, if you don't know that that's a common part of grief, it can make you question your sanity. You can start to
Yeah.
think, I'm going crazy. It's really not. It's just grief fog. And usually it lifts, it takes time for that to change sometimes. Sometimes people feel super numb and then they'll worry about themselves because they feel numb. I know I definitely did. I was really high functioning in the beginning and actually really worried about myself because I was so high functioning. I thought,
Right.
is there something wrong with me? Because I've got it together,
Right.
and then I would fall apart, but then judge myself when I had it together. So, it's a really messy, usually for most people in early acute grief. And then what tends to happen is that it starts to smooth out in a way. We kind of get back to a functioning place where if we wanted to go back to work, we probably could. We're getting the things done, the day-to-day things. People on the outside probably look at us and think we're doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And we can understand why they think that because we are maintaining appearances, right? But on the inside, we don't feel good. We don't
Right.
feel like they think we do. And you will hear things like, "Oh, you're so strong. You're doing so great." And
Mm,
you're like, I don't really feel so great. If this is what great feels like, I don't think I want this, right?
right.
But we're functioning. I call that a grief plateau.
Mm,
And I think it's an important place to notice because when you're there, what happens a lot of times is that people will be inclined to stop there. They will be inclined to think, well, I've heard about this new normal that people keep talking about in grief. So maybe that's it for me. Maybe this is my new normal and maybe I should just get used to what this is like. So for
gotcha.
me, that was like, I should just be grateful that I had him and I should just focus on the kids. And at least I had my shot at love. And at least I know what that feels like, but it's probably never going to happen again, but I'll be okay. I'll get used to it.
Right.
Right. As opposed to what we actually know is possible now, which is post-traumatic growth, which is no, you can take any life experience, grief, trauma, anything that's happened to you, right? And use it to inform the life that you want to live in the future. You can not just bounce back to where you were before, but you can actually take a life experience and use it to bounce forward, right?
Hmm.
To go forward and live a life that you love even more than the life that you had before. Not that you wanted the loss,
Right.
but because it's your prerogative as a human,
Right.
I kind of think about it like tornado because I live in
Mhm.
Kansas, talked about that. She's like, where do you live? Yeah, nobody
Shocking,
knows. But in
shockingly,
Kansas, we have tornadoes.
we had a tornado 2 days ago.
You had a tornado in Boston?
It was like a EF0, but it was like not fully fought, but it was close enough.
No way.
Yes. Climate change is real.
Oh, that's crazy. Well, so okay, proof that it can happen anywhere, right? But
Yes.
like a tornado comes and it knocks your house down. You need somewhere to live. So you could either try to rebuild the exact same house that you had, or if you've lived there for any amount of time, you've probably learned some things from living
Mm,
there, right? Like maybe you want a different kitchen layout. Maybe you want a bigger, bathroom in the primary, like whatever. You want something different. And you know that because of your life experience in that house. That's post-traumatic growth, right? It's taking what you've learned in your life and applying it to your future choices.
mm,
So for me, it was like, do I want to be in this job anymore? I don't think I do.
yeah.
Is this what I want to do? If life is this short, do I want to be in
Mm,
aviation? Like my husband did. It was his passion. He loved it. I didn't. So for me, it was a chance to say, you know what? This isn't really what I want. I don't hate it, but it's not the mark I really want to leave on the world. Right. So I left that job and I did something else. It's an opportunity to reconcile relationships. Is this relationship healthy for me? Am I just in it because I've always been in it? Are these the
right.
people I want to surround myself with? How about my spiritual life? Am I just swallowing what was taught to me, but I don't actually, it's not something I've chosen for myself? What do I choose for myself? Right? Making those choices that that have you living a life that's even more aligned with what you want. And you integrate, right? It doesn't mean you're not sad anymore about what happened. Doesn't mean you don't have emotions about it. It just means you've now decided how you want to integrate that part of your life into your life and you're making choices accordingly.
Gotcha.
That's what we're going for.
Yeah. And it's sometimes like taking that step away from yourself and just kind of, if you could like remove your body from your body and just kind of take a view of, that big 30,000 foot view of your life and be like, am I happy or is it grief? Am I, where are the pieces in my life that are causing me to like question myself?
Yeah. Like what is aligned and what isn't? What do I value? Who am I even?
Right.
All of those questions that can feel a little bit overwhelming, but there's so much value in answering them and really bringing yourself back to that point where you see that you do get to choose. I know for so many people we get into autopilot mode. We're
Yes.
just like okay, well I got to get I get the education and then I get the marriage and I get the job and I have the kids and I do the things and it's just we're just doing what we think you're supposed to do as adults on the planet. And then you don't know that it's precious and you don't know that it could end at any time. And then it does, right? Then something happens. And then it's like a huge wake up call, but in the most painful way and also in the most opportunistic way, right?
Right.
It sucks. And you get to decide, all right, now what? Who am I? Who do I want to be? Am I being who I want to be? Right. And then it just like shakes you.
And, even as we're having this discussion, I think it's also worth, even if, the whole God forbid, having that conversation with your aging parents, having that conversation with your
Mm,
spouse about what if, so
please.
that
Yes.
you don't have those guilt feelings of, for example, when my uncle died, he knew he was dying and he wrote this very specific letter about how he wanted things done.
Mm,
And, you know, so there was no, what would have dad wanted
yeah.
conversations. There was no, what would he have wanted? It was, he was very like crystal clear. And he was basically was like, my mother was his executor and she's like, listen to what she's like, whatever she says, it's in this letter. So shut up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so that
Wow.
it kind of
Yeah.
like didn't have any infighting. And so, when that happened, it kind of, I think, woke all of us up that, what, it is as sad as it like you don't want to ever think about those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
To have kind of like to help you, those of us who remain understand, like,
Yeah.
because sometimes you're like, well, what would Hugo wanted? Like, would he have wanted this? Would he have wanted that? And you're like, but these aren't decisions I want to make right now. Like I have so many other decisions. And then you put on top of yourself, like, what the person who's
Yes.
not here want.
Yes. And having been there and having not had those discussions, I know so deeply what you're saying, right? Where I genuinely didn't know in some of those instances what he wanted. And things like even basic things like passwords.
Yes.
Do I know how to access all the accounts? Do I know where everything is? And if you don't, it's, I definitely encourage conversations ahead of time, detailed information ahead of time. Makes your life so much easier if something were to happen. When something happens, it's not even if, it's
Yeah.
when.
And what made me, one, my uncle and the letter, but the other thing is, one of my husband's very good friends, sudden death, very similar story to yours, couldn't get into his phone.
Yeah.
And you know how much stuff is in your phone, but until this happens, you're like, I can't do two-factor authentication because I can't get into the phone. Like it just was,
Yep.
and take the whole rigmarole to prove things, and you're just like, this is the last thing on earth I need right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. We had not, so Hugo had a son. Well, he was technically a stepfather, but it was the only father that Lance had ever known. And we didn't have that discussion of what money should be set aside for Lance. Right. And it's not my biological child, my stepchild. I really didn't know. So to go through that and figure it out, I mean, we got there, we figured it out, but wow, it would have been a lot easier if
It
Hugo had
was
said before,
There
hey,
was a
here's the
letter.
plan. Right. There was no letter.
Well, and you're fortunate that you knew about the relationship, that you knew
Mm-hmm.
that what a special relationship they had,
Yeah.
versus you could have been a new relationship. Like, I don't know you.
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah. The discussions in advance, so valuable. And even discussions like, not that you need your partner's permission to be in another relationship, but I've
Yes.
seen so many women who never really heard that from their partner, and what a gift it would have
Yes.
been to hear, hey, I'm okay. You live for you and I love you and I want you to be happy and do what that means. Or, they hold on to a business that they don't want to hold on to, or
I've
a
seen that.
property that they don't want to hold on to. And yeah, just giving permission to it's okay to let go, as you said, and live life the way that you want to live it when I'm gone.
It's funny, that was on my list because I I have a friend, her father died. They had this huge family business, and she's running it and hates it.
Yeah.
And no one in the family wanted it, and so she's just kind of stuck, because you're like, you know would dad have wanted us to sell?
Hmm.
Would dad have wanted us just to, like, let it fade into the sunset? Like, and she's stuck there, and they're still kind of in that, like, swirling
Yeah.
vortex of what to do with this thing.
Yeah. Honestly, it happens all the time. I see it happen all the time. A lot of people own businesses and the spouse dies and they're trying to figure out what to do
Right. And you
and put so much pressure on themselves.
right, they put so much pressure, because, like, if you were there from the beginning, you saw the grind, and you're like, am I, like,
Hmm.
being disrespectful if I'm like, I don't want to grind? Like,
Hmm.
like, you realize, like, aviation wasn't your
Hmm.
passion, and if it was always in a business you own, but you
Yeah.
were like, what, I've stuck it out because something he started and I felt like I needed to continue. Or do you hold on
Yeah.
to it? Imagine if you had children,
Yeah.
like, do you hold on to it, and you have littles, and do you hold on to it in the hope that your littles want to evolve into the business?
And then maybe they feel pressure because they don't want it. Yeah. And I think it's then even more complicated by just, I, I wish and hope, and we're headed in this direction, I do believe, but that women are taught more and more that it is okay to want what we want, and it's
Yes.
okay to not want what we don't want. And we can make those decisions for ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we're self-centered or selfish or, any of that. It just means that it's okay for us to live in accordance with the life that we want. And sometimes that's not what they would have wanted for us or what they wanted, you know?
Yeah. And and the other thing is talked about relationships, and I feel that there's judgment.
Mhm.
There's a certain period. I mean, is there a certain period? Is there not a certain period? And but I now feel like, especially now, like, there are times when you knew your spouse, that they were, not going to make it based on
Yeah.
a diagnosis. It could be a sudden thing. that, you should grieve a certain amount of time before you start a new relationship. And there, my mom's neighbor, his wife had like a long battle with cancer and lived longer than they gave her. And, probably 6 months later, he started dating someone else and, came to my parents and said, hey, I just want to let you know, I'm, now dating Sally Sue. And I just want you to be okay with it. And my mom's like, you good? Cause I'm good. It's like, she's like, I can't judge you because I saw everything you did for your wife. And if this person makes you happy and is a companion, good.
I love it.
Great. But it's like, like that pressure that you put on yourself that I have to justify that it hasn't been whatever the period amount of time is to tell the world why this is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even sometimes there's just kind of like a lack of self-trust. I think we're even taught, well, you don't want sex. You just miss human touch. You should just get a massage, like stuff like that. Right.
Right. Or get a dog. Like what? No, it's very,
You don't make big decisions in the first year as though somehow you can just put all your big decisions on hold,
right.
Stuff like that, that just can make you think, well, because I'm experiencing grief, somehow I don't know what I want anymore. I can't trust myself to make my own decisions. And I got to do what other people think is best for me, which is common and super disempowering,
Yeah.
and just optional.
Completely. And, I'll agree that like maybe in the first 30 days, they'll make a big decision, but when you're getting like 6 months on and you've like slotted through all the crap, you get to the point where like, you know what? I don't want to live in this big house and I want to sell it,
Yeah.
or I don't want whatever it is that you don't want, or I want to move to Kalamazoo, like whatever it is, you get to decide to be like, you know what? I'm not happy. And or living in that house just doesn't make me feel like, makes me think every single day about every memory is in a room and you're like, I got to get out of here.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can like trust yourself to make your own decisions. I mean, I'm an advocate of, if there's a big decision to be made and it has a deadline, can we extend the deadline? Like, can we push the decision off if we don't really want to make the decision? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, because, especially if it's spousal loss, there's a lot of decisions in the early
Oh God,
days.
yes.
They just have deadlines. You just got to make them.
Right.
But then also, like, if you aren't really trusting yourself, who in your world do you trust? Can you get a
Yeah.
group of like advisors, who you can run big decisions past, just to get, because you value their opinion, not because you need it, but because it feels good to you to have it. It's just not realistic to think that we're not going to make big decisions.
Right. And it's always nice. I mean, even if you didn't have loss, it's always nice to have a sanity check, to be like, am I just like, because I shoot from the hip. And so sometimes I need someone to pull me back by the ponytail and just be like, have you thought this fully through? Like, not, this is with grief or without grief. I do have a tendency to sometimes bite off more than I can chew. And sometimes I need a little bit of a sanity check. And I'm grateful that I do have people in my life that I could be like, am I being crazy right now? And I'll be like, girl, you are. And I'd be like, all right.
And you love them and you trust them and they have your best interests in mind. And it feels good to you to have them in your corner, as opposed to, I need other people's approval.
Right.
To be okay, which is
exactly. Exactly. Approval is very different than like a sanity check. And from time to time, we all need that in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to do, the conversation we're going where it's like, you decide where you are, like when you're ready to take the next step, like you said, there's just certain things that you just got to get that done immediately. Like, there's like just life crap that it just, you need to tie it up, as soon as possible. But then there are other places that you can be like, you know what, I'm not ready to open that door. Maybe they have an office in your house and you're like, I'm not ready to go in there.
Yeah. And there's no rush.
And maybe you're never going to be ready to go in there and you're going to be like, you know what, I'm going to call that friend and they're going to go in there and they're going to deal with it.
Yeah. I love that. I'm so glad that I didn't push myself to deal with this stuff, and I let it happen in a way that felt right. Like you know, I remember at one point my kids were gone for the weekend and I decided, okay, in the closet, I feel like I can handle his pants.
Mm.
Like for some reason, his pants didn't feel so emotional to me, and like some of his work stuff. And so I started there,
Yep.
you know, and then I would come back and I would do a little bit at a time as it felt right to me. But people will have opinions about how long it should take you to go through this stuff and what you should do with it, and most of them aren't helpful.
No, and
Sadly.
so the one thing I'd love to ask you is, so, as someone who has a bit is a widow, what are some of the things that people should say to you? Because it's like
Mm.
you always become the um you're like, I don't, like you don't want to say the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
And and as you said, people are like, oh, Krista, you're so strong. and,
Yeah.
and you're like, that's the last damn thing I need to hear from you.
Yeah. I mean, I always say you're probably not going to say the right thing. And if you just make peace with that going in, it's a little easier, right? If you're like,
Right.
I got to say the right thing, then you're going to be stressed out about it. And it's just, we're humans. We're probably going to mess it up. And, it's okay. Then the next thing is what tends to be received as the most dismissive is when you're trying to make the person feel better.
Mm.
And we understand why we do this, right? If we think emotions are problems and the goal of life is to be happy,
Right.
then when we see someone who's hurting and we don't have the capacity to be okay when they're not okay, we will try to change them.
Mm.
Oh, they're in a better place. Oh, this was part of God's plan. Oh, you're young, you'll find someone else. Oh, they're not suffering anymore. We will say things because we don't know how to be okay, aren't when they don't feel okay.
Right.
And if we can go in knowing that have a problem and we are okay no matter how they feel. We don't need to feel better so we can feel better. We're just going to be with them as they feel what they feel. That's what was the most supportive to me, when people would just be like, this sucks. I love you.
Right.
Can we you want to go to the bookstore? Like we just go
Right.
to the
Exactly.
bookstore, but nobody was trying to, how do you really feel? Are you okay? Are you really okay? Like,
Right.
like trying to pry or trying to get me to have an experience that wasn't what I was having. They were just with me as I had the experience, and
Gotcha.
they didn't try to make me different.
Yeah.
That's so powerful.
And so I know for me, one of the things that I've been very conscious of is uh, when someone dies and you're friends as a couple, to really just make
Mm-hmm.
sure that I reach out, in a regular interval to the widow, to just be like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
Krista, what's going on? How you doing today? And it just in
Mm-hmm.
a like, I don't want them to ever feel like just because the spouse is gone, the friendship is gone.
Mm-hmm. Widows everywhere are applauding for you right now.
I,
Because I mean, the third wheel feeling is so common. And listen, I hope you don't put all the pressure on yourself, because even if you are reaching out, it's still entirely possible that sometimes we will still decide we don't belong, no
no,
matter how many
uh,
times you ask us, right?
no,
But kudos to you for like recognizing that it's all the secondary losses, right? That's another thing I wish I would have understood early on in grief. There's the primary loss
right,
right, and that's one thing, but then there's all the secondary losses, all the losses that happened because of the primary loss. So couple nights are a great example of that, or couple friendships, right? When you're used to being in a couple and one dies, then you not only have the primary loss of the spouse, but then you have the loss of that couple experience.
yeah,
And those losses are like death by 1,000 paper cuts, because they just keep coming. The primary loss is finite. It's done. You can adjust to that. The
right,
secondary losses never stop, right?
yeah,
Even in the future, you expected that when your daughter got married, they would be there, and you had grandbabies and they would be there. And like, it's, loss after loss after loss. And that's important.
yeah, and and I, for what you said, it's like I'm always respectful of like, meeting her where she is. And I'm like, and I know that for sometimes she's like, she might not be comfortable already and it's her story and I don't want to change her story. But I'm always like, hey, whenever you want, I'm like, we want to come up and have lunch with you.
Mhm.
And, be like, just whenever you're ready. And I know for certain things, like we both bought second homes at the same time and
Mm.
they were going to come down like 2 weeks after he died. And she's like, I invited her. I'm like, I go, whenever you're ready, I'm like, come on down and we'll still go out to lunch. And she's like, I'm not ready. And I'm like, when you're ready,
Mhm.
you know where I am.
Mhm.
And so it's, being respectful of her boundaries.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but I know for me, like one of the hardest parts was just like, just call her up and just be like, it's Cindy. Like it's just Cindy. Like there's no other thing. Just talk to her like if you were calling her up on a regular day.
Yeah. It's so easy to feel forgotten by your friends. It's like this weird space where your world will never be the same again and you watch other people going back to business as usual and
Yeah.
it's just it hurts you. Like you just can't you understand it, but yet it's such a thing to get used to. And sometimes, it's like that early couple of months period where the food stops coming,
Mm,
and people stop calling you every day, the cards stop showing up, and then you start to kind of feel alone. And
yeah.
so just some of the most meaningful things that people did for me were just text messages,
Yeah.
just little reach outs, just, and I'm thinking of you here and there meant so much to me just to know that I wasn't forgotten and that he
Yeah.
wasn't forgotten.
Yeah. And because it made, this kind of made me think of like when, someone gets divorced and you're just kind of like, like you said, that coupleness, like that's just who your identity. And then
Mhm.
depending on the situation, certain friends, fall by the wayside. And you kind
Mhm.
of like you said, it's like a death by a thousand cuts. You're just like,
Yeah.
here comes an event, and you're like, crap, I'm got to go by myself. And you have to psych
Mhm.
yourself up, and you're just like, please don't say the wrong thing to me because I'm trying to be here for at least 2 hours.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's such another great example of grief too, right? As you saw yourself being married to that person and now you're not.
Yeah.
Even
Or
if you ended it.
yeah, right. You're just like, this is what your fairy tale was. And then you're like, okay, no more fairy tale, time for plan B.
It didn't go according to plan.
Yeah, exactly. So for someone listening, like, what's one thing that you would say, like you've just had a couple of things that you said, oh, I would have, looking back now, I wish I did this a little differently, this a little differently. Like, what's one thing that like, you're like, this is for sure, I wish I did differently, after everything happened.
For sure, I wish I had learned earlier how to support myself through grief grenades.
Mm.
And by that, I mean nothing complicated. And so many tools work, right? So even just a simple like hand on the heart, take a deep breath, and give the emotion permission to flow through. You know,
Mm.
um, tapping. I love
Ah,
tapping emotional freedom technique and I
yeah,
teach it so much and I wish I had used that earlier. And I knew about tapping before and I used it a little, but I think I would have had a much easier experience if I had used it more. Um and the other thing that I wish I had known is that time doesn't heal.
mm,
And people will tell you, well, just stay busy, just stay strong. Basically, just buckle down. The first year is the worst.
right.
And as much as we want that to be true, and as much as it's nuanced, it just isn't true that in and of itself, the passage of time, heals. I think it's valuable because your brain does need time to adjust to the new reality, right? Your brain needs time to stop predicting that your person should be there or that life should be the way that it was. And over time, that will happen. The more your brain gets exposed to the new reality of your life, the more it starts making accurate predictions instead of telling you that, they should be in bed next to you or whatnot. So there is value in time passing, but it really is important that we consider how we take care of ourselves
Mm,
as time passes. That's why you hear so many people saying the second year is worse than the first, because they thought time was going to do all
Yeah.
the work and they didn't learn how to take good care of themselves. And then time passed and they woke up in year 2 and went, well, crap, I don't actually feel any better. Like this
Yeah.
is real now, as
Right.
opposed to how can I learn to support myself earlier and figure out what I need and what self-care looks like for me. And,
Right. Because,
find that.
probably because in the first year, you're so busy, like unraveling all of the life stuff that you probably
Mhm.
didn't really sit down for a hot minute to really process your grief. And so then
Yeah.
here comes year 2, and you're like, I still feel bad. And you're like,
Yeah.
because you didn't feel anything the first year.
Yeah, you just like white knuckled your way through it. You're just like, gripping and holding and like surviving. And that's nothing to be mad about, as far as like, we don't need to be mean to ourselves about it. But the more we can figure out what is supportive and helpful to us in the earlier days of grief, the easier grief gets,
Yeah.
because we can better support ourselves and give ourselves what we need. And, so many moms that I work with, they just put themselves last
Oh
on
God,
the
yeah.
list.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't work.
It
I
doesn't.
mean,
It works, so it doesn't.
right. And then honestly, what ends up happening is that you have kids that later look back and wish you had taken better care of yourself, because they see you not taking care of yourself. You're not they're actually now worried about you instead of just worried about them. So, we got to, it's self-care. We got to figure it out.
Yeah.
Hard to do, but
But you said
oxygen
something,
mask on us,
right? You said something that I thought that was an interesting term. You called it a grief bomb. How would you describe
Oh,
this
grief grenade. Yeah.
grief grenade? How would you describe a grief grenade?
Yeah. It's like those moments where it's a complete surprise of emotion where you're not expecting it. So, it's nervous system based. Sometimes it's not. So I don't make blanket, but like, this was years after Hugo died. My partner went to Las Vegas. The car that I had driven that Hugo was getting into the trunk of when the car accident happened was a Toyota Camry, a silver Toyota Camry with like the little fin on the back. That was my car. And the last time I saw a silver Toyota Camry was literally the most awful thing ever. Right. And I'm years out from this loss. And we go to Vegas and the Uber driver picks us up. And what do they pull up in? A silver Camry with a fin on it. And where do we have to put our luggage? In the trunk of the silver
Oh,
Camry. And so my whole nervous system went, oof, we're unsafe, right? Like intellectually, I knew I was safe. My nervous system did not know that. And
mm.
so it was just this poof of, intensity, right? So I describe that as a grief grenade, but it's not always just that kind of a memory from the past that was traumatic. It can just be all of a sudden a song comes on.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But now I get
And,
it. It's just
and
some
it's,
random thing that just pops in that just like,
you're just living life and
yeah.
then whoa, you are, intense emotion that you didn't expect. And how do you support yourself when that happens? And how do you also not make yourself wrong because it happened? Because so many people will say, oh, well, there's something wrong with me. I must not be doing it right. That shouldn't be that intense,
And
but sometimes it is.
but I think like you said, it could be any everything has an emotional trigger, good, bad, or indifferent. It could be I hear a song and I remember, oh my God, that trip to Aruba, that was so much fun. Or it could be like, oh, the trip to Aruba, what a shit show that was. Like
Yeah.
everything has its place.
Yeah.
And so, you know, just as a human, we are going to have those emotions. And you're right. Like there are those times that just like those emotions sometimes just knock you to your knees when you're not
Yeah. You're just not
expecting it.
expecting.
Or
Mm-hmm.
those emotions could be like the most euphoric thing you've ever experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And like to your point, it is part of the human experience. Wouldn't it be an easier experience if we normalized that for ourselves and we didn't make it about right or wrong or good or bad or, any of the judgment that just adds suffering
Yeah.
to the emotions. It's just so not necessary.
Yeah. And it's always, our judgment of like, what are people going to think? Am I doing it right? As we
Mm-hmm.
started the conversation, am I doing it right? And I mean, as after hearing from you, there is no right way. It's like, what's like, how are you feeling in the moment? and let's just start there.
Your grief experience is going to be your grief experience. You cannot do it wrong. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. 100%.
So Kristen, I want to thank you so much for your time. I've like learned so much about this, and it's just, very for my listeners and hopefully, new listeners. I hope that everyone just realized, like, you do you. Like in anything in life and in grief, you have to do you. And I want to say, find that support system, that group of people who, like, maybe if you are getting crazy, they can just call you out and just say you're being crazy, or that person who you can just literally like sit on their couch for a week and cry your eyes out if that's what you need.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And I always ask all of my guests what's one thing that makes you feel magical?
Um, right now, there's a lot of magic around my kids. So, like I'll tell you this. My youngest, he's 16, and I'm just so in awe of him sometimes. He's a teenager, so he's a brat sometimes too. But the emotional awareness that that child has is magical to me. Like, I
Right.
swear he is sometimes the things he says just blow me away. And I just am like, I get to be this human's mother, and he is magical. And that makes me feel magical.
Right. Because you're like, I wasn't having these conversations when I was 16. Who are you?
I know. Sometimes the stuff he said, I'm just like, buddy, like the awareness that you have at 16 he's an old soul. I don't know if that's a
Yeah.
thing, but I kind of think it is.
It's a total thing.
And it just blows me away. And I learned so much from him. And early parenting was about survival. And
Yeah.
sometimes those moments are still, but the older they get and the more personalities they have, the more it really does feel like I'm just magical.
Nice. I love that. It's funny. I met a 11-year-old this weekend, and we had this very in-depth discussion about Friends, the TV show.
Oh, the TV show. Okay.
In-depth discussion about Friends, the TV show, and characters. And I'm like, hang on. I'm like, you're 11. And I'm like, you weren't even a thought when this show was on TV. And he's like, oh, I just binged all the seasons. I really love that show. And I'm like, having this conversation. I was like, this is what I would have a conversation with an adult about.
Isn't it fun to think about that? Like, we can have really cool conversations with people who aren't even born yet.
Yes.
Like, they're going to be old enough for us to have conversations with them, and they aren't even a glimmer in someone's eye yet.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And so, like, I get what you're saying, that you're just like, I wasn't that intuitive or into anything when I was that age.
No. And I'm like, and I birthed this human. But I don't think I did that.
Right.
Yeah, but it
You're
sure
like,
is magical to like be a part of it.
And the magic stardust of parenting, I got a good one.
Yeah, I did. I got 2 good ones for sure.
So is your youngest 16 and your oldest is
19.
Oh, nice. That's a good separation.
Yeah. She just got back. She did her freshman year study abroad. She did a Costa Rica in the fall and in Spain in the spring. And now she's having a really hard landing of coming back to Kansas and trying to figure out, how do I adjust to
we're not cosmopolitan here.
We're not Spain. But it's the life experience she's supposed to have. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Krista. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And anyone, Krista, where can they find you on the socials?
Yeah. So on Facebook, it's Coaching with Krista. On Instagram, it's Life Coach Krista, and website Coaching with Krista. And then the podcast is called the Widowed Mom Podcast. And I would encourage people to listen, even if they aren't widows or moms. Honestly, if you just want to learn about grief, or you're interested in post-traumatic growth, or how you can support someone who's experiencing grief, it's good information.
Yeah. I never really thought about any of this until my friend Amy, she's a state lawyer, and it just, the hard conversations you got to have now. And and it sucks. And if you're, I don't know, you're never going to be prepared. But if you can go in knowing that there isn't these 5 steps that I'm going to go through, and I could start with anger, and then I could stay there for a long time.
Yeah. My experience won't be wrong.
Right.
No matter how it happens.
Yeah. And so I think listening to your podcast will be very eye-opening, even if you are not in that position. But if you have been in that position, knowing that, you know, if you're still in that like grieving stage and it's been umpteen years, it's okay. You don't
Yeah.
have to get over it.
Yeah, totally. Please, please don't tell yourself you have to get over it. You're going to move forward with it, but there's no such thing as getting over it. It's not the
Yeah.
goal. Thanks for being willing to have a conversation about grief, Kim. Truly.
No, I want to have these hard conversations because sadly it's coming for all of us. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just a matter of when. And especially
Yeah.
during the last several years that we've had, I think
Mhm.
many of us have experienced it more than we ever thought in our life.
Yeah, totally. Agree.
So thank you so much for taking the time, and I will chat with you soon. All right, Magic Makers, please, please, please reach out to Krista if you are feeling anything, or if you have a friend who needs to hear this, feel free to share this episode.